The Knights Templar didn't hide treasure. They hid something way more valuable. For centuries, treasure hunters have been digging up random fields in Europe looking for gold that probably never existed. But here's what most people miss. The real story of the Templars is actually stranger than any legend about buried coins. I spent months going through historical records, and what I found completely changed how I see this whole treasure mystery. Because it turns out the Templars were doing something much smarter than just stashing gold in the ground. So let's talk about what really happened to the wealth of the most powerful military order in medieval history. The year is 1307. Friday the 13th, actually, King Philip IV of France orders the arrest of every Templar in his kingdom. Overnight, thousands of knights are thrown in prison. They're tortured, forced to confess to crazy charges, and eventually burned at stake. But when the king's men raid the Templar headquarters in Paris, they find almost nothing. No massive piles of gold, no legendary treasures, just some basic supplies and regular church stuff. This is where the legend starts, because everyone assumes the Templars must have known the raids were coming. They must have hidden everything beforehand, right? Not exactly. The Templars were warrior monks who formed during the Crusades to protect Christian pilgrims traveling to the Holy Land. That part everyone knows, but they became something totally different over their 200-year existence. They invented banking, like actual modern banking. If you wanted to go on a pilgrimage to Jerusalem in the 1200s, you couldn't just carry bags of gold across Europe and the Mediterranean. You'd get robbed within a week. So the Templars created a system where you could deposit money at one Templar house and withdraw it at another, using encrypted letters. They were running international wire transfers 800 years ago. This made them insanely rich. Not because they were hoarding gold coins in basements, but because they were essentially medieval bankers, collecting interest and fees on transactions happening across the entire Christian world. They owned thousands of properties. Farms, vineyards, mills, entire villages. They had their own fleet of ships. They made loans to kings and nobles. They were managing the economy of multiple countries. So when people talk about Templar treasure, they're imagining the wrong thing. The treasure wasn't a chest of gold. It was a massive economic network. Now back to that night in 1307. King Philip owed the Templars a huge amount of money. He'd borrowed heavily to fund his wars, and he couldn't pay it back. The Templars were basically his creditors, and they had enough financial power to make his life very difficult. So Philip came up with a plan. He worked with Pope Clement V to bring charges against the Templars. Heresy, worshipping false idols, all kinds of accusations that sound completely made up, because they mostly were. The charges were designed to justify seizing all Templar property and canceling his debts in one move. But here's the thing that feeds the treasure legend. Some Templars did escape. The arrests weren't perfectly coordinated across all of Europe. Some knights in other countries got warnings. Ships left Templar ports in La Rochelle and were never seen again. So where did they go? What did they take with them? This is where facts end and speculation begins. But let's look at what we actually know before we get into the wild theories. The Templar fleet from La Rochelle vanished. That's documented. Several ships left port around the time of the arrests, and there's no clear record of where they ended up. Some historians think they sailed to Scotland, which hadn't recognized the Pope's order to arrest him. Others think Portugal, where the Templars were simply renamed as the Order of Christ and continued operating. Some even claim they reached North America, but that's getting into serious conspiracy territory. What could they have been carrying? Probably not gold coins. Those were already spread across their network of properties. Most of the liquid wealth was in the form of property deeds, loan agreements, and financial documents. But there were relics, religious artifacts the Templars had collected during the Crusades. Some very valuable possibly some actual gold and silver items from their treasury. The thing is, none of that would have been enough to fund some secret Templar society, continuing to operate for centuries afterward, which is what a lot of the legends claim. Let's talk about Oak Island for a second. There's this island off the coast of Nova Scotia where people have been digging for treasure since the 1700s. Theories claim the Templars buried their treasure there after sailing across the Atlantic. There's zero evidence the Templars ever reached North America. None. The timelines don't work. The navigation technology of the era makes it extremely unlikely, and after 200 years of digging, nobody has found any Templar treasure on Oak Island. What they have found is a lot of old wood and some coins from different eras, which makes sense because pirates and other groups used islands like that for centuries. But the Templar connection? It's speculation built on speculation. The same goes for Rennes-le-Château in France. There's this story about a priest who supposedly found Templar treasure in the 1800s and suddenly became wealthy. Except when you actually investigate. The priest was probably just selling massus and taking donations from wealthy parishioners. Not very mysterious. Here's what actually happened to most of the Templar wealth. King Philip seized the French properties. Other European rulers grabbed what they could in their territories. The Pope officially dissolved the order in 3012 and transferred most remaining assets to another military order called the It wasn't hidden. It was just redistributed to people in power. But some Templars did escape with portable wealth. That's not really disputed. The question is what they did with it. The most likely scenario, they used whatever gold and valuables they had to start new lives under different identities. Some probably joined other military orders. Others became merchants or settled down as minor nobles using assumed names. If you escaped from being tortured and burned alive, would you be thinking about preserving some grand treasure for future generations? Or would you be thinking about survival? The romance of the treasure legend makes us imagine these knights as guardians of ancient secrets, carefully hiding mystical artifacts for centuries. The reality was probably much more practical and sad. Now let's address the big one. The idea that the Templars were guarding the Holy Grail or the Ark of the Covenant or some other biblical relic. This comes from the fact that the Templars were headquartered on the Temple Mount in Jerusalem, the same location where Solomon's temple supposedly stood. So the theory goes that they were digging under the mount and found ancient Jewish treasures hidden there. It's a cool story. There's just no evidence for any of it. The Templars were there to protect pilgrims and fight in the Crusades. They weren't archaeologists, and if they had found something as significant as the Ark of the Covenant, someone would have written about it. Medieval people loved writing about miracles and holy relics. The silence in the historical record is pretty telling. What the Templars actually had was much more interesting from a historical perspective. They had a sophisticated financial system that wouldn't be matched until the Renaissance. They had architectural knowledge that shows up in Gothic cathedrals across Europe. They had diplomatic connections spanning from England to the Holy Land. They were basically a medieval multinational corporation with a military arm. That's what made them powerful. Not magic relics, not buried gold, but economic and political influence that threatened kings. So why does the treasure legend persist? Why are people still looking for Templar gold 700 years later? Because we want to believe that good guys who got betrayed by corrupt powers managed to preserve something valuable. We want there to be justice in the story. Hidden treasure that will someday be found and prove that the Templars weren't heretics. They were heroes. It's the same reason people love stories about lost gold mines and buried pirate treasure. It represents possibility, the idea that there's still something amazing waiting to be discovered. But here's the twist. There might actually be Templar treasure still out there, just not the kind anyone is looking for. Remember those documents I mentioned? Property deeds, financial records, encrypted letters? Those would be worth more than gold to historians. They'd tell us exactly how the Templar banking system worked. Who owed money to whom? What properties they owned? Where? That documentation probably existed in multiple copies across their network. When the order was dissolved, a lot of records were destroyed or lost. But medieval parchment is incredibly durable. Somewhere in an old library or a church archive, there might be boxers of Templar documents that nobody has properly examined. That would be genuine treasure, not monetarily, but historically. We've found documents like this before. In 2001, researchers discovered records from the Templar trials in the Vatican archives. They'd been there for 700 years, just mislabeled. The documents showed that Pope Clement actually found the Templars innocent of heresy, but dissolved them anyway for political reasons. That's the kind of discovery that changes our understanding of history. So if you want to hunt for Templar treasure, forget about digging holes in French forests. Start looking through dusty archives in old European monasteries. The other kind of treasure that might exist: Templar buildings and structures we haven't fully explored yet. They built thousands of churches, fortifications, and preceptories across Europe and the Middle East. Many of these buildings are still standing. Some have been continuously used for other purposes over the centuries, but architecture from that era often included hidden chambers, false walls, and underground passages for defense purposes. It's entirely possible there are sealed chambers in old Templar buildings that contain artifacts, documents, or yes, maybe some valuable items that were hidden during the arrests. But we're talking about historical artifacts, not legendary supernatural treasures. The real story of what happened to the Templar wealth is actually more interesting than the legend. It shows how medieval power worked, how kings manipulated religion for political ends, how an organization could be destroyed overnight, not because of what they did, but because of what they owned. It's a story about money, power, and betrayal, which is way more compelling than a simple treasure hunt. The Templars were real people dealing with real problems. Some of them were probably corrupt. Some were genuinely pious. Most were just soldiers and administrators doing a job. When their order was destroyed, they reacted like real people would. They tried to survive. Some succeeded by disappearing into normal life. Others were caught and executed. The idea that they maintained some secret organization guarding treasure for centuries afterward, that's fantasy. Fun fantasy, but fantasy nonetheless. What they left behind was influence. The Templars helped spread Gothic architecture across Europe. They established banking practices that evolved into modern finance. They created one of the first international organizations that operated across national boundaries. That's their real legacy, not gold coins in a hole. So next time you see a documentary about Templar treasure hunters using ground-penetrating radar in some random field, remember the treasure they're looking for was never buried there. It was spent, seized, or dissolved back into the medieval economy centuries ago. The real treasure is the historical record itself. The story of how these warrior monks went from protecting pilgrims to running Europe's economy to being destroyed by the very kings they'd served. That's worth more than gold. If you want to learn more about actual medieval history, hit subscribe.